Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, praise the Lord. It is story time. And you all know what story time is. I simply tell a story, and you simply tell how the principle, ordinance, and edits of God help you in your journey today, as well as protect you in your journey. And as you pass the story along, how it another in their journey. Now remember, all the stories are not original, and all the stories are not my own. This is a story today. There once was an old man by the name of Mr. Perry. Now, Mr. Perry was the janitor of old Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church. Now, Mr. Perry had been Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church janitor for many, many years. He had retired too, from the old mill. He also had retired from the service, but he had been that janitor at that church when the church was a little bitty old thing. He used to cut the grass, you see. Then as the church grew and grew and grew, they end up getting people they had to get people with the riding lawnmower. He used to ride and cut it himself, but it grew so big, they had to have more than one people riding and cut it. They got many separate, different campuses on there where they got, all kind of parts to the church. Old Ebenezer's a great big church now. So, they got more than they got, different type of lawn people that helps with the lawn care outside where they cut the grass and the bushes and the planting of the flowers and the mending to the trees and things of that nature, that kind of stuff. They even got a few orchards and stuff like that, vineyards, you see, that they got the people taking care of those. Old Ebenezer Church done really built up, But, when he first started there, working there, being that old janitor, it was a small church, quite small. Yeah, some old tales could be told about old Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church. But he lives about 9 blocks from the church. Now, it's a funny thing about Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry is a simple man. He not fancy, nothing about him is fancy. He got a nice little house. Miss Perry done went on to be with the Lord. She was a Sunday school teacher many years at Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church. She was a Sunday school teacher, and she also was a school teacher too. Uh, she retired and everything, and they was married for almost 50 years. Yeah, it's a good old time Mr. Perry had. Now, Mr. Perry used to come in from work, and he had a workshop out there in the garage where he worked on different things. Most of the stuff he worked on came from the church. A lot of the stuff that he worked on came from the church and from the people from the church. bring stuff over for him to work on and stuff. He still work on stuff from the people from the church. Bring him over to work on stuff. He pretty nice handyman, you see. Pretty nice handyman. Always had the radio on to the broadcast, for which they broadcast from the church, you see. You always like to listen to them, to their church station and stuff like that. Even had a radio on the front porch. Had it always tuned to the, ever since they started their broadcast. He been listening. He laughs at a few of the shows. He liked several of the different to the shows that they have. He some of them he don't miss and never miss 'em. Oh, he just loved it all the way. Yeah. Now, people in the neighborhood know Mr. Perry. They know what he does. Got on the left side of him, got Miss Johnson. Now, Miss Johnson, she's a widow of two. You know, her husband and Mr. Perry was good friends. You know, Mr. Johnson was one of the deacons at the Ebenezer, and they were good friends. And he worked in the mill too there. He had retired, but you know, they were good friends and everything. As a matter of fact, the car that Brother Perry got, he had bought it from Mr. Johnson. He still got it too, Brother Perry. It makes it on down to the church and all that, you know. Miss Johnson cooks every now and then, bring Brother Perry a nice home cooked meal. He likes that. She always cook a meal on Sunday and bring him one. Every Sunday she bring him a meal. Now on the right side, a couple of doors down, it's Mrs. Armstrong and Mr. Armstrong. And they always look and check on Mr. Perry. They go to Ebenezer too. You know, they bring him over some food as well and check on him and things. Make sure he's doing all right, you know. Next to them is the Taylors. They've been on that neighborhood for a long time and they always checking on Mr. Perry. He like the grandfather of the neighborhood, you see. Now, the house right next door to Brother Perry, you know, was owned by a guy by the Calvins. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Calvin both passed, and it ended up being taken over by some real estate company. It didn't bother Mr. Perry at first. You know, he didn't mind. A couple of people had moved in there and they had moved out. Pretty soon, a few other people then moved in and moved out. Then all of a sudden, this guy moves in, moved his stuff in. It was on a Saturday. And nobody saw him that Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Brother Perry was sitting on his porch, and all of a sudden, he sees the fellow. Fellow pulls up there and gets out of the car. He gets out of his car, he got a couple of cases of beers and a couple of guys with him, and they see Mr. Perry sitting on his porch. They just laughing and giggling, staggering around and drinking their beers and laughing. And they goes on in the house and they laughing and he hawing and goes on in there and shut the door. And after a while, a couple of more cars pull up there and they go on in the house and a couple of women pull up and they goes on in the house. The music go to playing and Mrs. Armstrong come on down with some food and Mr. Perry goes on in the house and eat. And they wailing over there and singing them songs and playing that music for quite a while. And no, he didn't know who called the police, but somebody called the police. Police come over there and knocks on the door and tells them, listen, y'all got to cut this music down. And police check them out over there. And after a while, people start leaving and music goes quiet. And so the next day, about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Brother Perry done come on in and old car wiggle on up there and he gets out the old car, shuts the door, goes into his garage and workshop, turns on the radio, gets an old lawnmower and pushes it on out there, gets him a chair and sit down beside the old lawnmower and pulls on it a couple of times and looks at it and takes some old liquid and stuff and unscrews the spark plugs couple other pieces and drops them into the fluid and start cleaning the old lawnmower up and with his toothbrush and start scrubbing a few areas and cleaning the cook off of it and stuff. Got through cleaning it, it looked brand new. Put the old spark plug and the pieces back. Hit that old primer a couple of times and yanked it and it started right up. Let it run a little while, shut it off, filled it up with gas. And by this time, he could see the young man next door coming on out there in the back. He said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm all right." He said, "I'm Charles." He said, "Well, everybody called me Mr. Perry." He said, "How you doing, Mr. Perry?" He said, I having a little gathering of my friends yesterday, and the police came by." He said, "Hmm." He said, "That's interesting." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I didn't disturb you, did I?" He said, "Well, you were a little loud yesterday." He said, "But I didn't call the police." He said, "No." He said, "No, sir." He said, "No." He said, "That's a nice lawnmower you got." He said, "Well, it ain't mine. People brought it to me to be fixed." He said, "Just fixing it." He said, "Oh, you're a handyman, man, good at fixing stuff." He said, "Well, I'll do all right." He said, "I see you got a flashlight." He said, "Well, yeah, I got one." He said, "Well, I gotta go down in the basement and I ain't got no light down there. It's a little dark down there." He said, "Well, I better go down there with you because it might not work too well for you." He said, my stuff's kind of funny. He said, well, I know how to use a flashlight. He said, well, okay, go ahead and try it. So he took it and went on down there. About right when he got ready to put the lawnmower back, he come back up, Brother Charles did. He said, well, something wrong with your flashlight because it didn't work for me. He said, well, I told you my stuff is kind of funny. He said, let me go on down here with you. Old Mr. Perry took the flashlight, walked on down there, took the flashlight and shook it, pushed it, and the flashlight came right on. He looked around, found what he was looking for, and come on back, put a light bulb up in there, and turned it and hit the switch, and it came right on. He said, well, I sure appreciate you. Thank you, sir. He said, no problem. Come on out and come on up on over there and put the lawnmower on in the garage and shut the garage on down, you see. Now, Mr. Perry looked up and he was standing there. He said, I appreciate your help, sir. He said, no problem. He said, you know, we got a local church in the neighborhood there, Ebenezer down the street. He said, oh, that big old church down there. He said, yes, sir. He said, I'm the maintenance man down there. He said, but I sure enjoy the church. He said, why don't you come on down on Sunday? The young man said, well, I'm not really too much into that God kind of stuff. He said, well, God really into you, though, young man. He's really into you. He said, maybe next time, maybe next time. So about a couple of weeks done gone by. He done saw Mr. Perry sitting out there on his porch, going back and forth to his, when he get off, going back and forth to his old workshop and stuff like that. So he had made a plaque, you know, had his name on there, and he wanted to hang the plaque on the front of his house. So he, about the third week, he waited on Mr. Perry to come on home. Because he noticed Mr. Perry had a drill on back there that he could use. So he waited for Mr. Perry to come on home now from the church. And he asked Mr. Perry, he said, well, can I use that drill? Mr. Perry said, sure you can, son, but I think I better do it for you, son, because my stuff is a little funny sometimes. He said, well, I'm just going to be right out here in the front here. I just want to drill this on and, you know, put the screws on into this thing here. I just want to put my name on the front of the house now. He said, well, you go right ahead. Mr. Perry took it right on up there, opened that drill and put a brand new fresh battery pack in there and handed it to the young man. And the young man walked toward the front of the house, got on up there, put that screw up there, held that thing in place, and went to try to drill. Just wouldn't work. He did it over and over again and kept it. He brought it on back to Mr. Perry. He said, Mr. Perry, he said, it just don't seem to want to work right. Mr. Perry told him, I said, come on, son, let's see what we can do together. Might just need a Midas touch. Showed Mr. Perry where he wanted it. Mr. Perry went on up there, took that old screw, held it into place. While he held one end of that wood and he held the other end, took it, zzz, took that other screw, zzz, put that other, zzz, double screw. Huzzah! Old boy looked at Mr. Perry. Said, "Is that all you need, son?" He said, "I guess so, Mr. Perry." He said, "That's awful strange." He said, "Don't let it bother you, son. Don't let it bother you." Mr. Perry walked on back. Mr. Perry looked at him as he got in his driveway. He said, "Son, what you doing this Sunday?" He said, "Well, I ain't got nothing planned." He said, "Well, we'll have a real nice service this Sunday. Sure be nice if you come on by." He said, "Mr. Perry, the church stuff really ain't for me, Mr. Perry." He said, "I really, really think I like it that much. Really don't think I would." He said, "Well, the invitation always stand for you. It would always stand for you." Old Mr. Perry went on back there, put his old drill up, took that old battery back out of there, and put his old drill back in that old little case, and set his old battery over there. And he commenced to continuing to work on a old whacker that he was working on, putting it back together. A few hours later, he come on out and his friend next door had brought him a nice supper. Went on and eating his nice supper outside, nice cool summer evening, eating his nice supper, listening to his program, nice talk show, talking about the power of God's love. While he was sitting there eating, and neighbor come on over, Mr. Charles, talking to him and stuff. He went and played on in the house. He come back out. He said, "Well," he said, "I would like to go on over here to this store here, if you don't mind." He said, "Well," he said, "I got a license here." He said, "If you don't, can I use your car?" Mr. Perry said, "Well, Brother Charles," he said, "I don't mind you using the car, but the car might mind you using it. It's a little funny that way sometimes." He said, "Well, I know how to drive, Mr. Perry. Here's my license right here." He said, "I don't doubt you do." He said, "But the car's a little funny sometimes. You sure you don't want me to take you?" He said, I, "I'm just going up here to the grocery store. We'll get a few things. It's going to be a couple bags full. But if you don't mind, can I use that old car of yours?" He said, "Go right ahead." So he handed him the keys, you see. He got in that old car, and Mr. Perry get on up and go on in the house. After about 5 or 6 minutes, Mr. Perry, listening to the news, he heard somebody say, "Excuse me, Mr. Perry," talking through the screen. He said, "Yes, sir. You back from the store already?" He said, "No, sir. Never made it away from the house." He said, "The car didn't start." He said, "No, sir." He said, "Sir, let me go ahead and run you to the store." He said, "Okay." Mr. Perry grabbed that old hat of his, you see, went on out there and got on in the car, stuck the key on in there, turned the key, and started right on up. He said, "Now that's strange." Drove him over to the store, went in there and got his groceries. Mr. Perry went in and got them all. a little produce stuff, a little snack on. They come on now. Come on back out, stuck the key in the car, drove on back to the house. He took his groceries and went in the house. Before he went in, he said, Mr. Perry, he said, now, I asked you for your flashlight and went on down in the basement. I tried to turn it on and it didn't work. He said, you come and took that flashlight and turned it on and it came right on. He said, I asked you for your drill. He said, I turned on that drill and it didn't work. He said, you put that drill in your hand and you turned it on and it worked. He said, I just asked you to use your car. I know how to start a car. He said, I turned that thing the same way you turned it and it didn't work. You come right out the house, turned it and it started right up. We went to the store, you come right back out, turned it the same way I did, and it started right up. He said, now, Mr. Perry, I don't know what's going on, but if you can explain it to me, I sure will be grateful. He said, well, I can, but I will if you come with me this Sunday on down to Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church. After church, we're going to have a church picnic this Sunday. Why don't you come on now? He said, okay, sir, I'll do that. He said, as a matter of fact, I'll ride with you that Sunday morning. He went on down to the church, you see. And while at the church, old Mr. Perry introduced him to some of his friends. Old Mr. Perry sat in a certain section right up front. He sat right beside Mr. Perry. That old young preacher stepped up to that pulpit. Now, mind you now, it's quite a bit of people go to that church. Thousands, in fact. But old Charlie, they called him, felt as if that young preacher was talking to nobody but him. Like he was the only person in that church. And the title of the message was, now get this, give it back to God. That young preacher said that it might not work for nobody else, but if you give it back to God, it'll work for him. He said that a lot of times that life seems to look like it's so difficult and so hard. It seems like you have a lot of fun in the beginning, but all of a sudden things start going downhill. And you'll smile and pretend like you're having a lot of fun, but many a nights you have a lot of tears and a lot of heartache and a lot of pain. But if you give it back to God and become used by God, He can wipe away those tears. He said, many of you haven't had an opportunity to give yourself back to God. He said, I'm going to give you this chance today. And by the time that young preacher got to the service, that you can give yourself back to God, old Charlie was one of the very first ones up to give himself to God. Now, by that time, old Mr. Perry didn't even have to tell him how come the things worked for him and it didn't work for him. You see, at the picnic, he looked at old Mr. Perry and he told me, he said, I understand that, Mr. Perry. He said, sometimes when you got something in the wrong hands, it ain't gonna work. But when you got in the right hands and they using it for God's use, it always works. Mr. Perry just sat there and smiled. Mr. Perry said, well, grasshopper, you have taken the pebble from my hand. And Mr. Perry just smiled. You see, one of Mr. Perry's good shows that he liked to watch on TV was that picture, Kung Fu. The moral to the story is real simple. We got to give everything back to God for His use. Not only ourselves, but everything that we have, all the way down to the vehicles, to our homes, all that we have, if we give it back to God for His use and to glorify His name, watch God take care of it and multiply it. Listen, remember, Jesus loves you. He always have, and He always will. This is our story today. Have a blessed day. Bye bye now.